is an Australian-born television news and sports producer who swapped the studio for a writer's garret overlooking the Tamaki estuary. His debut novel, Tugga's Mob, was inspired by 3 seasons working as a tour guide on double-decker buses around Europe in the 80s. Thank goodness I was there in the 90s. What happens on tour doesn't always stay on tour is his tagline. Thank you, Stephen.
I'll just give a bit of context first. The story is about a dream trip, the big OE, that turned into a nightmare for a young Kiwi girl. Has anyone here ever travelled with Topdeck at any stage? The book, as said, starts in the 1980s. I was a Topdeck tour guide and driver for those 3 years. So Judy Williams from Waikato, she goes off in big OE, London, Paris, Gallipoli, everything that everyone dreams of. Along the way, all those great adventures were recorded in a diary. There were no mobile phones in those days. That diary also recorded a campaign of sly sexual harassment from one of the other passengers, Tugga and his mates. And it escalates. The times, his attacks were ignored or went unnoticed. So it escalates to even more serious crimes and leads to a murder, a crime that goes unpunished for 30 years until the rediscovery of Judy's diary. That starts a campaign of revenge that the perpetrators never see coming. So the part I'm going to read is from Judy's diary. It starts back in 1986. Day 1. Judy Williams from Waikato, New Zealand, is now officially in London. God, what a flight getting here. Delays in Sydney and then Singapore, but we weren't allowed to leave the airport. Such a long haul from Auckland to Heathrow, but it's worth it to be in what I've always considered the coolest city in the world. There are millions of cars, people and houses, and the noise is incredible. It's close to how I imagined it would be. No problems at Heathrow. My work visa was hunky-dory for a friendly immigration officer. Then it was off to find the Piccadilly line to Earl's Court. Smart girl. I followed the other backpackers, who led me straight to the tube. The energy in central London is amazing. So different from Te Awamutu, where nothing happens outside of rugby season. There's nothing for mum and dad to worry about. I feel safer here than in Hamilton. There's a safety in numbers. Bizarre thinking? Maybe, but I'm surprised at how comfortable I am in one of the world's busiest cities just a few days after leaving the farm. It was disappointing Charlotte had to cancel her ticket at the last minute because of her mother's illness. Family comes first, always, but it's good not to have a chaperone who might inadvertently blab about any shenanigans, especially to Russell. He knew when we met in March how long I've been planning this trip and how important it is. I'm glad he understands, and we'll see what happens with that relationship when I get back to New Zealand. The hotel in Hogarth Road was a hop, skip and jump from the tube station. It's grotty, and there's a shared bathroom down the corridor where you pay 25p for a trickle from the shower. I'm sharing the room with 2 Aussie girls. They're not bad for Victorians who have never heard of the All Blacks. We're off to an evening session at the nearest pub, the Prince of Tech. It's a few yards up the road, and there's no need for a black cab or a double-decker bus. They're on tomorrow's must-do list, plus Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, Big Ben, Camden Town markets, and everything else I can squeeze in. I'm sure the Union Jack Waver and the family, Mum, would want me to stay longer to watch the Queen trooping the colour, or even hunt down Princess Di for some charity event. But I can't stay, Mum. Europe is calling. Maybe next year. It feels like the centre of the universe in London with all these different cultures. I thought Earl's Court was supposed to be full of Kiwis, Aussies and South Africans, but there are thousands of Arabs, Pakistanis and Indians. The aromas from their cafes and restaurants are tantalising, and nothing like the takeaway shops at home. Reckon I'll pack on a few kilos before I even get on the bus on Saturday. Imagine 5 days in London, then bonjour Paris. Judy Williams, you're going to have the time of your life. For a 30-year-old trip diary, it was in remarkably good condition. The front and back covers were festooned with a montage of entrance tickets and holiday snaps of mid-20s travellers at Europe's most famous landmarks. They appeared to be Aussies and Kiwis, judging by the scrappy t-shirts, battered shorts and thongs, or jandals, depending which side of the Tasman Sea they called home. Droopy moustaches were the fashion for the men, who lounged on the grass in front of the Eiffel Tower. Most of the women wore summer dresses that would have seen them refused entry into Notre Dame, the Vatican, or a host of other must-see European sites in the 1980s. New Zealanders called it the Big OE, overseas experience. Australians never bothered with such lofty titles for their backpacking days. Although their aspirations were the same, to see the world and have fun. It was a rite of passage, a transition from the innocence of a carefree South Pacific adolescence to becoming citizens of the world. In the pre-digital days of the 60s, 70s and 80s, when baby boomers swarmed into Europe like a plague of locusts every northern summer, the adventures were recorded on Kodak cameras and in trip diaries, such as the one currently held by shaky hands. The images had faded slightly, but not nearly as much as might be expected, given the passage of time from the first excited scrawl to the latest perusal by the current reader, who wasn't the author. The pages were smudged here and there with finger marks and the detritus from life on the road. Pizza, sausage, calamari, beer, wine, chocolate. And Tibetines were out to taste everything, and oft-handled possessions such as diaries would carry lifelong reminders of those tactile experiences. It appeared though as if few people had read or even handled this diary in the years since that great adventure. Had this unique record of golden summer in a young person's life been hidden away, pushed to the back of a drawer, or dumped at the bottom of a cupboard or trunk, out of sight and out of mind? Did it contain memories that shouldn't be rekindled?
Thank you, Stephen. I spent a glorious month travelling through Scandinavia and Russia on a Kontiki bus full of Australians and Kiwis in '96. So I completely fell into the pages of Tugga's mob. And I can only imagine the stories any Topdeck tour leader would accumulate. And I'm almost too scared to ask whether you kept a diary.
The diary, or the secret diary of a tour guide, would be a bestseller if I ever wrote it. No. There are several reasons. At that time I was a journalist working for the ABC in Australia. Writing was work. Travel was an adventure. I wanted to get away from that. Anyone who travelled with Topdeck, you were together 24/7 for however long the trip was. 3 weeks, 7 weeks, 10 weeks, overland, 15 weeks sometimes. There wasn't a lot of time to yourself. In fact, some just don't know when to go away. A passenger from my last 10-weeker is still with me now. You know, I'm serving a life sentence that has reached 34 years. And the other aspect was safety. On a bus, items are left around, particularly on a Topdeck bus, and any diaries that might be left lying around were sort of quickly snuffled up and smuggled to the back of the bus, and people would be checking. And in the bar that night, did you know that Jane was shagging the flotilla skipper on Corfu? No, I thought it was Rochelle. No, she was with the Greek bar. So nothing was ever private. They weren't sacred. So any thoughts or impressions I would ever put down on paper might have got me sacked.
Thank you. So as a former journalist, I imagine your research skills are legendary. What was your process for researching Tugga's mob, or was it more a sit down, write, research required type book?
It came about purely by accident and unintended consequence of escaping back to Europe. I was due to retire last year, 2020, but I got this little niggle that things might change. We might not get back to Europe, so I convinced my wife to sell the house, quit her job, and take off into motorhome for 7 months in 2017. Reducing that pressure of work, mortgage, the adventure to look ahead to, cleared my mind. And in the lead up and preparations for Europe, I got on a thread of curiosity and everything unravels in front of them. So it's slightly different in that I have journalists who are playing amateur detectives. So I sat down. Once the idea came, I started to work on it. It had to put down on paper, took off on the tour. So each night as we were on campsite, I would be adding to it. I had an idea of locations, Australia, New Zealand and Europe, but being in Europe provided fresh perspective, included extra scenes and chapters from that adventure. So the research is actually probably the greatest fun in writing a crime thriller. You can go off on tangents. It's just never-ending story of research. It's fascinating.
Okay, thank you. And it was shortlisted for the Ngaio Marsh Award last year, wasn't it? Well done.
Thank you very
Congratulations.
much.